When I was younger and working in a photographic lab, one of the services that we provided was artwork reproduction. And without a doubt, one of the most difficult aspects of reproducing artwork in the form of a photographic print was accurately managing and matching color. Now, even with the use of color management software and custom color profiles, matching specific colors still proved to be elusive and required some fine-tuning. Now, in Photoshop, there are no other tools that could handle this task better than Selective Color. Now, Selective Color is located underneath Layer, and it's underneath New Adjustment Layer, and it's right at the very bottom of the drop-down menu. So we'll just bring that up. Now, Selective Color Correction is a technique that originated and was used by high-end scanners and color separation programs that change the amount of colors in each of the primary color components of an image. Now, what makes Selective Color great is that you can target and modify any color without affecting any of the other color values in your image. So, for example, you can actually specify a particular color by going to the little colors drop-down menu that's here and specify from either red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, or magentas, and you even have the choice of specifying highlights, neutrals, and blacks. Now, you'll also notice that there are no predefined settings for this adjustment window. So if you go up the top here where it says Selective Color, if we click on this little default window here, you'll notice there are no predefined options for you to choose from. So that's just another little side note. Now, the color sliders for Selective Color are in CYMK, which you'd be familiar with if you've ever done any traditional color printing on enlargers or worked in the pre-press industry. But in layman's terms, that simply stands for cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, which would simply represent the inks in a modern inkjet printer, for example. Now, as you begin to actually move the sliders around, you'll notice that the actual values are in percentages. So you're either going to increase or decrease the percentage of a color value, which we'll discuss further shortly. So essentially, if I wanted to, say, change the color of these beautiful Japanese blossoms, what I'd need to do is I would go and actually set this back to 0, and we'll go and actually select magenta as being the specific color that I actually want to alter. And then what I'd actually do is I would decrease the amount of yellow, for example, if I wanted to make these more purple, and then I could increase the magenta value, and then I could also increase the amount of cyan, and just for the fun of it, we could also increase the black value. So what I now have, if I actually go to the layers panel and we just turn off the visibility, we've gone from a sort of a realistic Japanese blossom color, which was that beautiful sort of light pink, which is quite beautiful to see. And then if we actually turn the preview back on again, we've actually turned them into purple blossoms. So that's essentially a very dramatic example of what you can do with Selective Color, but nonetheless, it does give you that amount of control. Now, in order to be efficient and effective using Selective Color, you need to understand a little bit about color theory and how additive and subtractive colors work, which I briefly explained in what I believe was the previous video on color balance. Now, below the color sliders, you'll also notice that we have a couple of checkboxes. We have relative and absolute. So as I jump between relative and absolute, you'll see a slight difference in the highlight values of the Japanese blossom, where they're actually going from sort of more of a yellowy reddy tinge, jumping further into a more of a purple and a colder tinge. And it's a little bit difficult to tell with this particular example, but just have a play around with it yourself and you'll actually notice the changes. But if you're after a more technical explanation of how this works, if we were to choose a specific color value and by that it would be a specific pixel value, and say it was set to about 50%, so say it was 50% magenta when you hovered over with your little eyedropper tool and you looked in the information palette. If you were to add another 10% of magenta using selective color, for example, and you had it set to what would be relative, the way that it's worked out is that it then actually takes 10% of the original value, which would be 50%. So 10% of 50% equals 5%. So you're only actually increasing the color value by 5%, which would essentially mean that you'd actually have 55% as being your color value. Now, if you would actually set it to absolute, you're actually going to end up with a different result. Essentially, you'll take that original 50% as the color value, and then you're going to add another 10% of magenta using selective color. What you'd end up with would be 10% plus 50% of the original value, which would actually give you 60%. And that would be the 60% of the color value. So instead of ending up with a value of what would be 55% using relative, you're actually going to end up with a value of 60% using absolute. So it's giving you a little bit more increase with your adjustments in selective color. So selective color is by far my favorite means of performing very controlled color adjustments without affecting other colors in your photographs. And if you've taken the time to play around with Camera Raw's HSL or hue, saturation, and luminance, you'll notice that there are some similarities. Now, selective color is a very powerful feature of Photoshop, and I recommend that you familiarize yourself with how to best utilize it with your own personal workflow.